Drones are definitely the most talked about and also the most important weapons on the battlefield today. Why do I say they're the most important? Because they're relatively cheap. They're much cheaper than most other weapon systems, whether anti-drone or offensive, like missiles that would perform a similar task to drones. Let's say that today the whole world is thinking that drones might be the new kings of the battlefield, that it's hard for anything to beat the effectiveness, the financial and economic efficiency of a drone to be used on the front lines. Therefore, armies around the world, including the Brazilian army, are betting heavily on these vehicles. What I want to tell you here today is that maybe we're witnessing a peak moment. That is, the peak effectiveness of a means of waging war, drones. And I want to show you that this is not the first time, and it won't be the last time, that we will experience this kind of scenario, because it is intrinsic. What I mean is that every new weapon brings with it a countermeasure, and every new technology will also bring with it a new countermeasure. That's as old as the world, ever since the first human being fought against another human being. Let's go back to ancient times, the sword. The sword brought an undeniable advantage. Undeniable for the army that wielded it. Instead of a stick, the guy now had a sharp piece of metal that could do much more damage with less effort. And of course, the advantage of this weapon was short-lived, because soon after the shield was created and armor was invented. This armor then had to be overcome by a bigger sword, which led to bigger armor until we reached the full suits of medieval armor. And to defeat those full suits of medieval armor, what was the innovation? It was gunpowder, wasn't it? In the same way with buildings, if you build a wall, you build a catapult to knock down that wall. But if the catapult knocks down that wall, you build a thicker wall, a more powerful catapult, an even thicker wall, until gunpowder comes along and puts an end to this game. This has happened throughout history, and around the end of the 19th century, more precisely, in 1885, an inventor named Hiram Maxim sold the first generation of the machine gun to the British Army, a truly automatic machine gun. We know that a few decades earlier, over in the United States, the concept of the machine gun, of a repeating firearm, was created, but it was a manual model. It was Dr. Richard Gatling's model, the famous Gatling gun. But Hiram Maxim sold to the English the first truly automatic machine gun, where you hold the trigger and the weapon spits out all the rounds from a belt of ammunition. In this way, war started to take on a completely different shape. And I'm not talking about a single concept. I'm talking about the way war was waged all over the world. And let's remember that the last major war in Europe at that time had happened more than 10 years before the introduction of the machine gun. That war was the Franco-Prussian War, which was the war that unified Germany in 1871. Therefore, when the machine gun really started to be widely introduced at the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, Europe was not going through major conflicts. These conflicts were happening in the colonies, in Asia, in Africa, but not on the continent itself. So what is going to happen in 1914? In 1914, the biggest conflict the world had ever known up to that time will break out, so much so that it became known as the Great War. Finally, the great European powers were not entering into conflict with nations scattered across the far reaches of the globe, or just to suppress colonial uprisings in their own territories either. No, it was one against the other. Germany against France, France against Bulgaria, Bulgaria against Russia, Russia against Turkey, Turkey against England. And then you already understand the scenario. How is it that everyone we keep trying to understand today, more than a century later, how was everyone so excited to start that war? We know how that ended, right? But why was everyone so excited to start that war? Because all those kings and kaisers and czars and sultans, all those guys were imagining that the War of 1914 would be another epic, heroic, chivalrous depiction of 19th century wars. What were 19th century wars like? Large pitched battles. Wasn't that how the Franco-Prussian War was? Great battles where forces came together. And on the field, groups, blocks of infantry face each other. And then, to break the deadlock, you send in your cavalry, made up of soldiers from the nobility with silver sabers, shining. So this cavalry will attack the enemy infantry from the flank and will cause them to break ranks, will cause the enemy troops to flee, giving you the victory. That was the picture of war. The war everyone trained for. That was the picture of war everyone expected in 1914. And that's exactly what happened in the first 30-some days of the war. Why? Soon after, on September 5th, remembering that the war started on July 28th, on September 5th, the Germans who invaded France encountered French troops along the Marne River. And in that French position along the Marne River, what was expected to be a last line of defense before the Germans conquered Paris. The German army was brutally halted. And how was it brutally halted? The German cavalry, which attacked the French flank, was met with a wall of lead that pierced the horses' chests and decimated those noble German cavalrymen, the German hussars. What happened when the French cavalry then tried to counterattack the German infantry line? All those French cavalrymen turned into Swiss cheese in front of the German machine guns positioned on the flanks of the infantry. What happened next? The infantry formations were cut down by heavy artillery on both sides. Another major effect of the Second Industrial Revolution, right? Another great innovation in warfare. The extremely large caliber artillery. So, what happened to those soldiers who didn't know where to run, who were being hit by direct fire, right? Direct machine gun fire and arcing artillery fire. That's all they could do. The only thing left for them. They started digging into the ground. There was no way to move forward. No one knew how to move forward. The technological supremacy of the machine gun couldn't be overcome. It was just that simple. And because of that, the only place to go was down. And that's how the infamous trench warfare was born. Is this scene reminding you of something? Did you just stop and connect the two events? Did you just connect the dots on what caused the trenches? Again? The biggest conflict since World War II? More than 100 years after the Battle of the Marne in 1914. Exactly. Defensive technology. The drone technology that neutralized all forms of attack and in 1914 reached the peak of its power. Let's say in 1915, right? It reached the peak of its power. Nothing surpassed the machine gun. In 1915, there was no way to move forward. Everything the Allied and German generals tried failed to break through the trench system. There was no way. There was no way to overcome a wall of automatic fire that could wipe out dozens of men in a second. A lot of things were tried. A lot of useless things were invented. And they ended up falling into disuse simply because they weren't really effective. How was the superiority, the supremacy of the machine gun overcome? It was overcome in 1916. It began to be overcome in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme with the introduction of tanks. The tanks, which were originally a designation, a decoy, a secret, so that no one would understand what that was. The English said that those blocks of metal, those metal boxes there, were water tanks. So that's why the vehicles got the name tanks, and to this day they're called tanks. So the tanks were used in the Battle of the Somme to break through the enemy line and overcome the machine gun. Have you ever stopped to think about it? A tank. The vehicle. Why does it look like that? Because the tank has them right there on the front. It's pretty obvious. It has 3 characteristics. The first of these 3 characteristics, and the one that really matters, is the weapon. The tank's gun is a large caliber gun. It has to be a large caliber gun. Why? Because the whole reason that vehicle exists in the first place, its primary indisputable purpose is this. It's the fact that it has to destroy machine gun nests. And how were the machine gun nests built? Out of concrete. They were built out of concrete. So to break through that concrete bunker, you need to use a large caliber gun. But that large caliber gun has to get close to the enemy trench and destroy the enemy target. The bunker. So it has to be able to withstand machine gun fire to get there safely, right? To carry the soldiers there safely in that vehicle. So that's why it has to be armored. It has to be armored. Armored enough to withstand automatic weapon fire, machine gun fire. That's why the tank has that steel armor. And what's the third? The third obvious characteristic of the tank? The tracks, right? Or treads. And why do they exist? They exist because you have to move a heavy vehicle, since armor is heavy, over terrain that's been completely churned up, right? Because of artillery impact. It rained a lot, so it turned into a big mud pit. And the way you move a vehicle like that is the same way a farmer gets around with a tractor out in the field, right? Tracks. So tracks are used to make a tank move. Did you understand why it looks like that? It looks like that because it had to be a weapon meant to counter machine guns. That's the only reason. Okay? So guys, the tank, right, which was used in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme, was still used in a pretty clumsy way. It took more than a year for it to be used the right way, right? That was at the Battle of Cambrai in November 1917. And right around that time, we saw the introduction of the first anti-tank weapon, which was the anti-tank rifle that the Germans developed. Panzerbüchse, developed by the Germans. What was that? Essentially a big rifle with an extremely large caliber projectile, so it could pierce the tank's armor. Remember what I said at the beginning of the video? Wall catapult. Thicker wall, heavier catapult. We're seeing the same thing. We saw it. So, We saw that throughout the 20th century, anti-tank weapons were being improved. Because suddenly the king of the battlefield, the thing that defines the battle now, was the tank, right? It wasn't the machine gun anymore. The tank literally runs over the machine gun. But who stops the tank? That's where anti-tank weapons come in. That's where the RPGs come in, right? The rocket-propelled grenades. Then there are the tow missiles, which are wire-guided missiles. Then come the dart rounds, right? Which are even fired by reconnaissance vehicles. And then comes the simplest of all, which is the Molotov cocktail. The cheapest and simplest of all, the Molotov cocktail. But only now, in the 21st century, have we seen the arrival of the ultimate anti-drone weapon. The ultimate anti-tank weapon. The one that finally stopped the tank. Which was what? The drone. In the war in Ukraine, man, we saw the tank become useless. There's no more offensive capability. That's why the men went underground digging trenches again. So the drone, because it's so cheap and so effective, made the tank useless completely. All the other ways to destroy a tank, the previous anti-tank weapons, had countermeasures built into tanks. All of them. Except this one. So far, nothing. So what do I mean by that? I mean that we are, once again, right now, in 2026, seeing the drone at the peak of its power. At this moment, the defense is up there, and the offense is down here. Look, that's why the war doesn't move forward. We're seeing this in Ukraine, and where else are we seeing this? In Iran as well. There's no way to attack because everyone is afraid of the drone. Everyone is afraid of the drone at this point. The drone is so cheap, so numerous, so effective, that no form of attack has been able to counter it. So what do you think is coming next?
O que será que...
We'll see, right, in the coming months and years, what could end the reign of the drone, considering the anti-drone methods already used. Jamming, missiles like the Patriot, and similar ones, and even shotguns, right? Soldiers in Ukraine use shotguns. All of that is very interesting, really good for you to handle one drone. One? But what about when it's a swarm? Which is what we're seeing. Which is what we're seeing Iran launch every day, hoping that one or a few will get past the anti-drone measures. And some are getting through. What's going to show up there? A very interesting system, a solution that was presented back in 2020 in the United States, comes from a company called Epirus. Epirus is the name of a region in Greece, quite important for military history. And interestingly, this system is called Leonidas. It's a system that uses extremely powerful microwaves to be able to bring it down. It triangulates the position of a drone in the air or a swarm of drones, simultaneously launches this energy pulse at them, and they are all disabled at the same time. Curious name, Leonidas, right? Why? Because Leonidas, as you know very well, stopped the great Persian army, much larger than the 300 Spartans he led. So you have a numerical imbalance there, right? Many against one, and also of being an anti-Persian weapon or a weapon against Iran. And last week, Epirus presented the Leonidas Autonomous Ground Vehicle, a new variant of its system, which is mounted on a pickup truck. It's mounted on the back of this pickup truck, and it's mobile. And it was designed to be used in groups, right? Just like you can imagine, the old BM-13 Katyusha 13 Katyusha were used and positioned on the battlefield. But this time for defense, right? Not for attack, for anti-drone defense. So if this technology here is still incipient, it's a technology that's in its early stages. It's developing just like we saw with the tank, right, in 1916. And a lot of people laughed at the tank in 1916. Don't forget that. A lot of important people laughed at the tank in 1916. So
Isso.
what can we expect in the coming years from a system like this? Leonidas AGV, Leonidas AGV, right? Autonomous Ground Vehicle. Some videos on the internet show very promising results. So, are we close to a solution? To get the drone down from its historic peak? Tell us in the comments. If you like this video, share it with your friends, and also give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to the War Room so you don't miss anything else. I'll wrap up here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from the War Room.